They said they loved you. They tucked you in, showed up to the recitals, maybe even called you their everything. But something always felt off. Because love, real love, doesn't leave you afraid to speak. It doesn't make you flinch when the phone rings. It doesn't come with that pressure to perform, to shrink, to keep the peace even when you're breaking. And yet, you told yourself it was love. You had to. Because what does it say about your childhood if it wasn't? So you edited yourself, played the role, tried to be easy to love, whatever that meant to them. But deep down, a question started forming, the kind you didn't dare say out loud. Why do I feel so unappreciated by the people who say they love me the most? This video is your answer, and not the sugar-coated kind. Because here's what nobody ever told you. Narcissistic parents don't see you. Not really. They see a mirror, a character in the story they wrote to protect their own ego. And the moment you started showing up as you, not the version they curated, the warmth changed. The compliments faded. The punishment got quieter, but sharper. They called it affection, but it wasn't unconditional. It was strategic, calculated, conditional on how well you played your part. Think back. When was the first time you felt like love meant earning your safety? That's where it began. And until you name it, until you understand what you were really surviving, it will keep shaping how you let yourself be loved today. Because this isn't just about childhood. It's about the guilt you carry now, the loyalty you can't explain, the way you still feel like the bad one for wanting distance. So let's go back, not to blame, but to understand. Because once you name what it wasn't, you can finally begin to see what love actually is. Let's get one thing straight. This isn't about demonizing your parents. It's about finally understanding the structure of what you were inside. Because narcissism isn't always loud. It doesn't always scream, belittle, or take up all the space in the room. Sometimes, it just whispers, "I love you, but only if you reflect me the way I want to be seen." That's the narcissistic personality structure, not just the disorder. At its core, it's not about grandiosity. It's about fragility, an identity so unstable, so hollow underneath, that it has to borrow your reflection to feel real. To a narcissistic parent, affection isn't a connection. It's a transaction. You make them feel special, stable, in control, and in return, you earn scraps of approval. Carl Jung called this the persona, the public mask we wear to survive social expectations. But narcissistic parents don't just wear the mask, they become it. And you, their child, become the prop that keeps it from slipping. Think about your childhood. Did you feel like you had to be perfect just to be safe? That wasn't love. That was ego management. Because narcissistic parents don't love you as you. They love the image of you that makes them feel competent, admired, powerful. Freud said, "The narcissist's love is always an echo. It reflects back what they already believe about themselves, or what they wish was true." So when you challenged the illusion, when you showed a need they didn't want to see, or expressed a truth that cracked their mask, you weren't just disobedient, you were a threat, a reminder of everything they're running from. That's why the punishment didn't always look like anger. Sometimes it was silence. Sometimes it was withdrawal. Sometimes it was that tight-lipped smile that said, "You're exhausting." Because they weren't responding to you. They were defending the mask. Ask yourself this. When you were upset, who did the soothing, them or you? If you were the emotional adult in the room, you weren't raised, you were recruited to be their reflection, their mirror, their regulator. That's not connection, that's enmeshment. Your worth wasn't rooted in being you. It was measured by how well you performed. If you made them proud, you were good. If you questioned the rules, you were difficult. If you spoke a boundary, you were disrespectful. So you learned to read the room, to anticipate their moods, to make yourself smaller, softer, quieter, just to stay close. Sound familiar? This is how the loop begins. Your love became a performance. Their approval became the payment. And every time you slipped, every time you acted like a kid, you felt the cost. So when people ask, why didn't you just speak up? They don't understand. You weren't afraid of punishment. You were afraid of disconnection. Because to a child, losing connection isn't just sad. It's annihilation. And that's the trap of growing up in narcissistic dynamics. You confuse self-abandonment with safety. You learn that love means keeping the peace, that your needs are too much, that being understood is optional, but being useful, non-negotiable. So pause and ask yourself, when did you learn that your job was to make others feel okay, even when you weren't? Because the moment you became the emotional stabilizer in your own family, you stopped being a child and started being a shield. And that's why it still hurts. Why you still feel responsible. Why a part of you feels guilty, even when they hurt you. Let's talk about that next. Because guilt, real guilt, comes from doing harm. But this guilt, it was planted, fed, weaponized. And if you don't name where that guilt came from, you'll keep mistaking obedience for love. Let's pull that thread. You were the good one, the calm one, the easy one, the child who didn't make a fuss. While other kids had tantrums or tested limits, you folded your feelings into neat little boxes and learned to smile through the ache. But you weren't born like that. You were trained. You were trained to feel responsible, to keep the peace, to protect the adults around you from their own chaos. That's parentification, when a child becomes the emotional anchor for a parent who never grew up. Maybe your mother confided in you like a best friend. Maybe your father made you responsible for your siblings, your silence, your stability. Pause for a second. Did you feel like the adult in the house, even when you were still a child? This is where the good child trauma role begins. It's not about being praised, it's about survival. You learned quickly. If you spoke up, you were ungrateful. If you had needs, you were dramatic. If you showed pain, you were too sensitive. So you stopped asking, stopped crying, stopped expecting comfort, and started chasing approval. That's how perfectionism is born, not from ambition, but from fear. A fear that if you ever let your guard down, the whole house would fall apart. Sound familiar? Did you get praised when you smiled through pain, but punished when you expressed it? Over time, that pattern creates a deep shame core, a belief that your real self is unacceptable. So you build a version of you they can accept. You get good grades. You keep your room clean. You say the right thing at dinner. You try to become what they want, even if it means abandoning who you are. But here's the paradox. You did everything right, and it still wasn't enough. There's a story I've heard 1,000 times. Maybe it's yours. A child grows up in a house with a mother who's always tired and a father who's always distant. They get straight A's, they never talk back, they stay out of trouble. And yet, They never hear, "I'm proud of you." They only hear what they could have done better. One missed chore, lazy. One moment of frustration, ungrateful. One emotional need, too much. So they become quieter. They walk on eggshells. They erase themselves, not out of weakness, but out of strategy. Because in that home, safety didn't come from being seen. It came from being invisible. Ask yourself, were you ever comforted for your sadness, or only acknowledged when you performed? That's the betrayal. Your nervous system wasn't wired around love. It was wired around management, around reading tone, anticipating reactions, keeping the storm at bay. You weren't nurtured. You were monitored. And your reward was approval, only when you disappeared. You weren't loved for who you were. You were valued for how well you disappeared. So when someone now says, "You're just trying to be perfect," they don't see the history behind that performance. They don't know that your calm isn't peace, it's hypervigilance, that your independence isn't freedom, it's a wound. Let this land. They told you that you were difficult, but all you ever did was ask for closeness in a language they didn't understand. And now, even in adulthood, a part of you still believes, if I'm just good enough, they'll finally approve of me. But the truth is, you could be perfect 1,000 times, and it still wouldn't register. Because what they were responding to was never your worthiness. It was their own emptiness. And unless you name that, you'll keep performing, keep pleasing, keep erasing yourself in search of something they never knew how to give. Let's unpack why that guilt still lingers in the next section and how it's been used to keep you trapped. There was always a cost. It might not have been written down or spoken aloud, but you felt it every time you needed something real. A favor came with a guilt trip. Support came with strings. Approval came only after performance. This wasn't connection. It was transactional attachment, where your value was always on trial and love was just the currency they used to keep you compliant. Pause here. Did you ever feel like your closeness with them depended on how useful, obedient, or pleasing you were? That's not affection. That's economics. And the terms were always stacked against you. You had to be calm when you were hurting, grateful when you were neglected, silent when you were misunderstood. Because underneath their affection lived an unspoken warning. Don't get too comfortable. I can take this away. And they did. The moment you stepped out of line, said no, showed pain, asked for clarity, they'd pull back. Cold shoulder, dismissive comments, sudden distance. This is what praise withdrawal looks like. A calculated silence that punishes you for being human. But it's more than silence. Sometimes they'd sabotage your wins, make subtle jokes at your expense, say things like, "Don't get ahead of yourself. I knew you before you got all this. Must be nice to have all that free time." These aren't random. They're emotional sabotage tactics, designed to clip your wings the moment you start to fly. Ask yourself, did their warmth vanish the moment you started feeling proud of yourself? And when guilt alone didn't work, they'd play the role of the martyr. Sigh heavily when you needed something. Remind you of everything they've sacrificed. Position themselves as the eternal victim, and you as the ungrateful one. You weren't allowed to grow unless it benefited their narrative, unless they could claim credit, or at least stay central to your story. But here's the truth they never wanted you to name. Their care wasn't free. It was leverage. This wasn't nurturing. It was negotiation. And the most chilling part? You internalized it. You began to believe that affection must be earned, that safety comes with a debt, that your value is contingent, always conditional, always at risk. This isn't just childhood programming, it's psychological bondage. And no one explained it better than Carl Jung. The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. Because that's what you were carrying, wasn't it? Their unmet dreams, their buried shame, their unresolved fear of irrelevance. You became the mirror they stared into, not to see you, but to see the version of themselves they couldn't become. So they latched on, projected, controlled. They didn't want a child. They wanted a proxy, a character in their story, not a person with a path. And even now, even if you've set boundaries, moved out, built a life of your own, they still try to hook you with guilt, still imply you've abandoned them, still find ways to suggest you're cold, ungrateful, detached. Because here's the part they'll never admit. If your worth is no longer tied to their approval, they lose the power they mistook for love. But what happens when you finally walk away and still feel like the villain? That's not just guilt. That's programmed loyalty, and we need to talk about it. You left, but the guilt stayed. Not because you were wrong, not because you were cruel, but because you were conditioned to feel responsible for other people's comfort. This is what trauma-bonded guilt feels like, a leash disguised as empathy. Ask yourself, have you ever felt more shame for setting boundaries than for being mistreated? That's not a personality flaw, that's programming. From the time you were small, guilt was the emotional currency of control. It showed up in sighs, in silence, in sudden coldness. It wasn't always words, it was withdrawal. They didn't have to punish you directly. They just had to make you feel like their pain was your fault. And so, you performed. You shrank. You apologized for things that weren't even yours to carry. Because somewhere along the line, you learned, if someone is upset, it must be because of me. That belief was never true, but it was useful to them. They used it to maintain access, to keep the dynamic intact, to make sure you stayed emotionally available, even when it cost you your identity. How many times have you gone back? Not because it was safe, but because it felt familiar. That's not weakness. That's neurobiology. Your nervous system doesn't crave what's healthy. It craves what it associates with survival. And if survival meant earning affection through obedience, suppression, or performance, that's what will feel safest, even if it's killing you slowly. This is why so many people stay too long, not because they're naive, but because their trauma wired them to equate approval with safety. You think you're choosing them, but really, you're repeating a pattern. One that started before you had words to question it. This is why, even after clarity, comes confusion. Why, even after the boundary, comes guilt, because a part of you still believes their pain is your responsibility. That's not empathy. That's enmeshment, and it creates a loop that's hard to escape. You see the manipulation. You try to distance yourself. They withdraw just enough to trigger your guilt. You rush back to repair, even when you weren't the one who broke it. Sound familiar? This is the invisible trap, the emotional hook that makes you doubt the very instincts trying to save you. But here's what no one told you. Just because someone misses you doesn't mean they value you. Sometimes they miss what you did for them, not who you are, not what you needed, just how well you played your part. And that's the cruel twist, because for years you weren't scared of being alone. You weren't scared of being wrong. You weren't even scared of being unloved. You were scared of what it would mean if they never really saw you to begin with. That's the grief no one prepares you for. Not the loss of them, but the loss of the illusion, of the fantasy that maybe one day your goodness would be enough. That if you just gave more, tried harder, stayed quieter, you'd finally earn the closeness you've always craved. But that closeness was never real. It was contingent. And now that you've stopped performing, you see the truth. You weren't scared to lose them. You were scared to stop performing and realize they never saw you to begin with. And that realization? It's where the healing finally begins. There's a moment every adult child of a narcissistic parent has where they think, maybe if I just explain it the right way. So you write the long message. You rehearse the perfect words. You walk into the room with trembling hands and an open heart, and they look at you with blankness, or worse, contempt. Not because your truth wasn't valid, but because your clarity felt like an attack. Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling like the villain, even though all you did was tell the truth? This is narcissistic injury. Psychologically, it's the ego's immune response to anything that threatens the false self. And when someone has built their identity around being the good parent, your pain becomes an accusation, even if it's unspoken. They don't hear, "This hurt me." They hear, "You're a bad person." And so, instead of reflection, they launch into defense. They weaponize your tone. They cherry-pick your flaws. They cry louder than you, until you're the one apologizing. How many times have you left a confrontation, feeling like the one who did something wrong? That's the loop. That's the trap. And here's the brutal truth. They would rather lose you than face themselves. Because facing themselves would mean confronting decades of avoidance, denial, and harm. It would mean dismantling the persona they've spent their life protecting. That's not an apology. That's a psychic death. And some egos would rather survive through illusion than evolve through truth. This is where your fantasy has to die. The fantasy that if you're just calm enough, kind enough, articulate enough, they'll finally understand. They won't. Not because you're failing to communicate, but because their survival depends on not hearing you. You're not speaking to a person, you're speaking to a fortress. And every time you knock on the gate, hoping for connection, you're handing them another weapon to twist into guilt. Do you still believe they'll change if you just find the right way to be understood? Here's the mythological truth. In Greek lore, Prometheus brought fire, illumination, to humanity. For that, the gods punished him endlessly, because truth is dangerous to those who rule through control, and like Prometheus, your insight isn't seen as a gift, it's seen as rebellion. They don't want truth, they want obedience. They don't want relationship, they want reverence. They don't want healing, they want hierarchy. You were never raised to be a person. You were raised to be a reflection, a mirror that made them feel good until the day you cracked and showed them what was really there. And now you're inconvenient. Now you're angry. Now you've changed, because the moment you stop agreeing to the false peace, you become the problem. Let this land. They don't want you liberated. They want you loyal. And loyalty in this context means self-abandonment. But what happens when you finally stop performing? When you stop trying to earn connection through silence? When you leave the stage and let the truth echo? Let's go there next. No one tells you how painful it is to walk away from someone who never truly saw you, especially when that someone was a parent. We talk about going no contact like it's an act of defiance, a bold move toward healing. But what it really is grief. Not just for the parent you lost, but for the one you never had. Because underneath the silence is a deeper wound. The hope you kept alive for years is finally gone. Have you ever cried over someone who never apologized, but still left a hole in you when you left? That's not weakness. That's the body detoxing from hope. Hope that they'd change. Hope that they'd wake up one day and say the words you needed to hear when you were 7. But they didn't. And they won't. And now you're left sitting in a silence that feels heavier than the chaos ever did. Because chaos had a pattern, guilt had a rhythm. At least you knew what to expect. But this is unfamiliar. This is the kind of pain you can't bargain with. Your nervous system was wired to associate attachment with survival. Even unsafe connection felt safer than isolation. So when you finally cut the cord, when you stop reaching for someone who kept hurting you, your brain doesn't register relief at first. It registers threat, because somewhere deep down, you were taught leaving equals punishment, distance equals betrayal, boundaries equal abandonment. Even if you were the one who was abandoned all along, ask yourself, do I feel guilty for choosing myself, even when the relationship was harming me? That guilt isn't a moral compass. It's a leash, one that was put around your mind when you were too young to question it. And now, every step away from dysfunction feels like a betrayal, not of them, but of your own wiring. This is the moment most people fold. They go back, they explain, they try again. Not because it was safe, but because the silence felt unbearable. Because at least the drama meant something was there. Here's the truth. You weren't addicted to them. You were addicted to the chase for something they never gave you. And going no contact is the moment you stop chasing. But that doesn't mean you don't still ache. You will. You'll mourn the version of you who kept hoping. The child in you who believed, if I'm just good enough, quiet enough, helpful enough, maybe they'll care. That child deserves to grieve. Because no matter how strong you are now, there's still a younger version of you that waited at the edge of their approval and never got picked. So if you're in the silence right now, and it feels suffocating, if your body is screaming, go back, even when your soul says, don't. Let this land. You didn't leave because you stopped caring. You left because you finally started caring about yourself. And yes, it hurts. It will. But pain isn't proof that you made the wrong choice. It's proof that you finally stopped betraying yourself for the illusion of safety. What part of you still waits for a parent that never truly arrived? Grief is the cost of clarity, and you are allowed to miss someone who was never good to you. But you're not obligated to go back, because the next time they reach out, it might not be because they changed. It might be because they noticed you're finally free. Let's talk about what happens when they come back, but not to repair, to reset control. They said you were dramatic, too sensitive, impossible to please. So why are they reaching out now? Why the message after months of silence? Why the unexpected like on a post you made about boundaries? Why the just checking in as soon as you started to feel steady again? It's not a coincidence. It's a pattern, because when you finally begin to untangle from them, when the guilt starts to loosen its grip, they feel it, and they come back, but not for connection, for control. This is the return test, a psychological checkpoint designed to measure just how free you've become. Most people think no contact is the end, but for narcissistic parents, it's just the beginning of the next phase. Because when your silence grows roots, they feel it like a power outage. Suddenly, they've lost their mirror, their emotional supply, the version of you that twisted into shapes just to keep the peace. And when they feel that void, they don't reflect, they reach, not with an apology, not with accountability, but with a hook, subtle, calculated, wrapped in concern or nostalgia. Thinking of you. Your birthday's coming up. Just wondering if you're okay. Not always malicious, but always destabilizing. It sounds harmless, but that's what makes it dangerous. Pause here. Ask yourself, if they cared now, why didn't they care when it counted? Is this message about me, or about reasserting their access? Am I feeling drawn to them, or to the version of me that still needed them? Because the moment you started healing, truly healing, you became a threat. Not because you were cruel, but because you stopped being compliant. Your growth rewrote the script, and in doing so, it forced them into a new role, one they never auditioned for. Irrelevant. They can't have that. So, they show up, recast as the concerned parent, the misunderstood protector, the one who's always been here. But this isn't reunion, it's recruitment. They want the old role back, the one where you silence yourself to preserve the illusion. And here's where the return test intensifies. They don't just want contact, they want confirmation that the old you still lives, that the part of you who felt responsible for their feelings is still on call. So they send something vague, low risk, a message that lets them claim goodwill and plausible deniability. If you respond, they still own real estate in your nervous system. If you don't, they plant seeds of guilt from afar. It's all part of the same strategy. Reframe your healing as abandonment. Cast your distance as cruelty. Turn your silence into an act of betrayal. But let's tell the truth. If they truly respected your boundaries, they wouldn't be testing them. If they genuinely missed you, they wouldn't be sending breadcrumbs. They'd be sending accountability. Yet what you get is avoidance wrapped in sentiment, hooks without healing, contact without care. So again, pause. Reflect. Are you being invited into connection or seduction? Is this message soft or slippery? Is it an opening or a trap? Because when you've spent a lifetime contorting to feel seen, even a breadcrumb feels like a feast. But here's the pivot. Healing is not about resisting their pull. It's about seeing it clearly and choosing not to bite. Carl Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This moment, this exact return test, is where unconscious patterns try to reassert fate. But you are not here to repeat, you are here to repair. Not them, you. So when they come back, don't rush to block. Don't rush to reply. Just Notice. Notice the part of you that still hopes they'll say the right thing. Notice the ache. Notice the flicker of guilt, the wave of nostalgia, the quiet craving for resolution. That's not weakness. That's residue. And it doesn't need punishment. It needs presence. Because here's the truth. They're not returning to reconnect. They're returning to reattach, to the old dynamic, the old version of you, the old role you've finally outgrown. So before you decide what to do with their message, ask one final question. Do I want to be chosen, or do I want to be free? Because you don't have to keep reopening the wound just to prove you've healed. You've spent your entire life wondering if it was your fault. Maybe if you'd just been easier, quieter, less emotional, less you. Maybe then they would have cared. But here's the truth. The one that breaks, then frees. It's not that they loved you wrong. It's that they never loved you. Not in the way a child should be held. Not in the way a nervous system learns safety. Not in the way that says, you matter even when you're messy. What you called connection was performance. What you believed was care was compliance. What you felt was guilt was grief wearing someone else's name. You were never too much. You were never the problem. You were simply raised by someone who mistook control for closeness and called it love. So let this be the moment you stop carrying their limitations like they were your flaws. Let this be the breath where you stop negotiating with the ache, where you stop trying to earn what should have been instinctual, where you stop confusing pain with proof, because their failure to care in a way that was safe, present, and unconditional is not your shame to carry. It never was. Let yourself grieve what you never got. Let yourself mourn the childhood that survival stole. Let yourself name the betrayal without cushioning it with excuses. And then, when you're ready, let yourself come home. Not to them, to you. If you finally walked away, not because you stopped loving them, but because you started loving yourself, comment below. That was the moment I came home to me. Your words might just be the reminder someone else scrolling desperately needs to see.